The energy firm Quadrilla has announced plans to explore for shale gas in 2 new parts of Lancashire. It wants to drill around villages between Preston and Blackpool. The Quadrilla chief executive, Francis Egan, told the Today programme What's in it for you if Quadrilla pitches up in your town.
There is a package of community benefits which is similar to other energy industries and renewable industries, which comprises £100,000 per well, and we've announced for each site 4 wells. That would be £400,000 per site. And we're still in the exploration phase, as you know. If we move into production, then there's a percentage of revenue which will go to local communities and the county. The potential revenues from the gas in our licence area alone, that's potentially £140 billion.
Well, some estate agents in the UK are reporting the subject of fracking now being raised by buyers. Great swathes of the UK have been identified as potential fracking sites. In America, where fracking is well underway, boom towns are being created as the drilling companies roll in. Bobby McCourt's an estate agent in Midland in Texas, a town that's been transformed by fracking.
Right now, our market is very hot. There's such a demand on housing, we're short on inventory. It's everything from $100,000 to $1 million. For every house that you have on the market, you have 5 to 6 people qualified to buy, and they just don't have a lot to choose from.
Bobby McCourt, an estate agent in Midland in Texas, talking about the great good fortune that fracking has brought for him. Well, Christopher Timmins is an economist at Duke University in the United States, and he's been studying the impact of fracking on house prices. Christopher, that estate agent saying that the house price is booming in his town, is it the same for every town with fracking across the US?
No, I'd say definitely that's not the case. And in particular, we've spent a fair amount of time looking at the situation in Pennsylvania and have found very different results.
So what was it like there?
We found large costs, in particular homeowners who rely on groundwater, private wells for their water supply. We found more mixed results for homeowners who are on the public water system, although we don't see in Pennsylvania tremendous gains anywhere really that we've looked.
People who rely on this ground source water, why are their property values not benefiting then or suffering from fracking?
The research would suggest that this is being driven by a perceived risk of contamination. Now, one of the problems in Pennsylvania and really everywhere that fracking has taken off is that we don't have a real good sense of whether there is contamination or not. This is largely due to the fact that water typically isn't tested prior to the fracking being undertaken. So what we're finding is that households that are in areas where they might expect there to be a risk are seeing large drops in value associated with that perception. The real trick, though, is disentangling that drop from potential gains. And in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the states, those gains largely come from royalty payments that are paid out when homeowners lease their mineral rights to the fracking companies.
And that wouldn't happen in the UK because here the ownership of the gas belongs to the government and not to whoever's land it's found under.
That's right. And what we find is for houses that are dependent upon public water sources, those lease payments look to be the main source of benefit, and they tend to offset costs likely being driven by noise, light, air pollution, heavy truck traffic, difficulties with water coming in and out, large quantities of wastewater being trucked away from the fracking sites. So we do actually find small gains to those sorts of households in Pennsylvania on the order of, say, 6%. Although when you get very close to the drilling activity, say within a kilometer, those benefits seem to dissipate and go away. For groundwater-dependent households, the ones that have private water sources, we actually find net losses in value associated with the fracking activity. These can be 3.5% drops in value when you're within about 1.5 kilometers from the well, and all the way up to about 17% of value as you get within 1 kilometer.
What about what that estate agent was saying then in Midland in Texas? He's reporting a roaring trade. I mean, it may not be the case in Pennsylvania, but surely there must be other parts of the states where it is going really well for people who've got property?
To a large extent, it depends upon how the housing market views shale gas and the risks. My impression from working with data both from Pennsylvania and from Texas is that fossil fuels are treated very differently in Texas to a large extent. There's a much greater familiarity there or just more experience with them. and the markets might internalize the risks and the potential costs quite differently.
Because Texas has the history of oil.
Yeah. The history of oil in Pennsylvania is there. It's just far further back in the history of the state. I will say as well that in Pennsylvania we found mixed evidence with respect to rental properties. And in some parts of Pennsylvania there are booming markets for rental properties and temporary housing to accommodate the workers that move into the towns when the fracking really gets underway.
What about insurance? Because you'd expect insurance would go up where there is fracking.
So in Pennsylvania, there have been documented cases now where home insurers are refusing to cover houses that are exposed to waste pits or near wells in general. Mortgage companies are starting to deny mortgage requests when the properties are near waste pools and drills.
Well, although it's early days, we wanted to see if the impact of fracking and the impact it's had on property prices in the US could happen here. Henry Pryor used to be an estate agent. He now works as a housing analyst. Henry, as I say, it's early days, and fracking exploration's taken place around Blackpool, where there were a couple of very small-scale earthquakes. Is there any evidence that it has done anything to property values there?
Well, there's no direct evidence yet because the UK fracking market is so immature, as you rightly describe, and we don't have the good fortune that the Americans have of research undertaken in the way that Christopher and his colleagues have done. What we do know is that looking back at the housing market across the UK, house buyers have always found it very unnerving when there has been talk of any kind of environmental influence, particularly negative influence on potential properties, and that has altered the way that they've looked both at buying properties and houses to rent. And if we look back at, for example, power lines, wind turbines, and indeed the invasion or ingress of radon gas in some parts of the country into houses, we can get perhaps a glimpse of what some people may find to be the future with fracking. It's still far too early to be able to quantify this, but it's certainly something that's causing a lot of comment.
So are people, when they are going to estate agents in particular areas, asking now about the possibility of fracking?
I don't think that estate agents or the big property websites have yet got a bespoke box to tick for people who are concerned, but clearly people are very, very exercised by what is going on, and we see that in the democratic process and the arguments to and for and against fracking across the UK. If you look at the maps that are now reasonably widely available online of where potential fracking may occur, we can see that there are extensive areas of the UK that could be impacted in due course, and that is, as always with the housing market, it's the generation of uncertainty that has probably the most demonstrable impact directly on prices.
A government report at the end of last year warned that traffic would increase in areas where there's fracking, and that tends to have a negative impact on prices, doesn't it?
Yes, I think that the things that people are going to look out for from a negative perspective are going to be increased transportation of waste products, as we've heard has happened in the States, at increased traffic as contractors go about their business, despite the fact that, of course, in the UK we're not expecting local residents to benefit directly from whatever fracking brings to a local community. That said, of course, there will be an upside for individual communities who will and should expect to see an increase or a spike in both property values and rents because of the increased workload that's going to happen in an area and the demand for housing that will go with it.
If you think, though, in the longer term, and you think of a place like, I suppose, Aberdeen, where North Sea oil has meant that house prices have increased over decades, but hugely, hugely. That could happen here too, couldn't it?
I'm not so sure that that is actually the direct comparable. I think that people's concern when they're talking about where they might want their family to live are going to be much more exercised by what might be going on beneath their feet rather than necessarily what might be going on in the local environment and the added employment that generates further demand for both houses to buy and houses to rent.
Henry Pryor, and before that Christopher Timmins, both speaking to me a little bit earlier.